In the quiet desert town of Silver Hollow, an ordinary afternoon turns extraordinary when two young German Shepherd puppies break free and vanish toward the old Ironshade bridge. Moments later, an 11-year-old girl follows, unaware she's stepping into a night of danger, courage, and choices that will change lives forever. What these pups do next will test the limits of loyalty and spark a rescue no one saw coming. But will it be enough? The town called Silver Hollow rested where the Mojave began to remember mountains. A quiet bowl of roofs and porches and wind-chimed eaves pressed against a horizon that rippled like hammered bronze under summer light. And even when winter came, the air held a mineral heat that rose from the earth as if the desert itself breathed through the crust. The main street wore its years with a kind of stubborn grace, paint sun-bitten to pale pastels. Glass, never quite free of dust, a diner that kept its neon humming through the afternoon. A hardware store with a bell that rang, in a tone older than most lives, and the kind of sky that stretched without apology cobalt. When dawn arrived, molten orange, when dusk took over star-shot indigo, when the night settled and the cold walked in without knocking. Silver Hollow had a rhythm people learned by listening. Trucks rolled out before sunrise toward quarries, and survey lines and backcountry trails that could swallow a man who thought he knew better than rock and wind. Children cut across lots of brittle grass to reach the school with the mural of a coyote and a comet. Mail reached boxes midday with a sleight of hand. Nobody noticed until it missed. And somewhere on the edge, beyond where asphalt surrendered to packed clay and bead-sized gravel, the land began to speak in creaks and sighs, in the low metal voices of abandoned structures that once mattered. Out there stood a bridge with a name that had slipped out of official maps but remained in conversations told in gas stations, and on porch steps, Ironshade, a span of girders, and rust, a geometry of fatigue stretched over a narrow ravine choked by sage and shadow. When daylight burned down and temperatures followed, Ironshade became a drawing of itself against the sky. The desert changed demeanors with the sun's exit shedding warmth and revealing edges, a place that smelled of iron and sage oil, and a memory of rain, although no cloud hung above. Tonight the wind moved in threads, hissing over gravel, snaring in the latticework of the bridge so that the entire structure sang a thin, teeth-on-metal note with each gust. The sound drifted down into the ravine and touched two men who lay trussed like bales under the eastern abutment. Their backs set against steel gone cold, their breath visible when the wind paused for them. Ryan Cole counted time by the distance between waves of pain. He had learned that long ago, where counting meant living a slow inhale to collect the split edges of himself, a careful exhale to keep the light from dimming the world, strobing at the margins with each pulse. 30 years old carried more miles than calendar pages in him. Broad across the shoulders without parade polish, skin brown to the color of dry cedar hair, cropped short by habit more than regulation. He presented the frame of a man built to carry weight and the gaze of someone who had carried it across terrain without signage. At the thigh, his tactical pants had darkened from mid-khaki to a black-brown map of what escaped the wound, and beneath that canvas, the muscle had swollen an angry knot around a tear that had started as a hot sting and now sat like a frost-bitten stone. Zip ties bit his wrists, a rough cuff carved into both ankles. A strip of cloth cut across his mouth, not tight enough to still breath, exact enough to rip skin each time he swallowed. Beside him, slack against a rib of the abutment, Elias Tran slumped in a posture that read as sleep from a distance and collapse from arm's reach. 27 carried speed rather than bulk. In Elias spring steel more than iron plate, a runner's economy of motion, the kind of presence that folded easily into a crowd and left a soft eddy in its wake. His hair had been clipped close earlier that week because he liked systems being in order, but dust drew new lines down his temples and across his jaw. One eye had flushed black-purple and closed itself into a tight seam. The other watched the world in drifting intervals. Dried blood had mapped a path from split lip to collar, a thin thread across his neck that made Ryan think of a river on an old relief chart. A gag had pressed a mark into Elias's cheek. The knot behind his head had been cinched by someone who understood leverage. Fingers behind his back flexed every so often, as if memory ran hand drills through the nervous system, even when consciousness took leave. They had stepped into Red Hollow Basin before noon because patterns had told them to. A federal brief had fed them the skeleton. A smear of suspicious permits, an arc of cash that curved around legitimate shipments. The way small towns bent like reeds when a wind of threat blew through, and their own work had layered muscle and nerve over it, night after night in a motel. With a soft, thin carpet and a door that never quite latched. Then, morning after morning at the edge of town, listening to tire tracks, drone footage chatter, caught in legal nets. They had found the string and begun to pull. Supply drops on mining roads, never fully abandoned handoffs, screened by mesquite and the decal of a legitimate contractor peeled at a corner if you knew where to touch. Each piece had offered a shape. By the time the sun stood high, they knew a convoy would pass a particular wedge of basin, and a contact would give a signal with a hand that had trembled when he asked for assurances. The ambush arrived without drama, which meant with precision. A pickup stopped as if to adjust a tie-down, and men stepped out with faces hidden by bone-white dust and neck gaiters patterned with old camo. A shift in the wind masked one set of footsteps. A tossed word drew attention left. A third figure moved right and closed distance. The first strikes landed open-handed to rattle brains without shattering ears. Then a heel clipped the side of Elias's knee while a baton found Ryan's thigh with surgeon's aim. Zip ties slid from a pocket and snapped closed cleanly. Someone spoke in an accent trained for regionlessness. Phones walked away in a canvas pouch. Their contact gave a glance toward the ravine and did not hold it long. Then the truck rolled again, and the two of them rode its bed for half a mile and then fell because hands that lifted them chucked them from a height that measured only inconvenience. The bridge accepted the delivery without comment. The ravine kept its own counsel. Cold laced itself through Ryan's uniform and took up a place along his spine. He leaned his shoulder harder into steel to feel something fixed. The wind combed through weeds and raised a dry rattle like rice in an old tin, then ran fingers along the bleached bones of shrub and found a single music in those stiff strings. He thought about heat packs. He thought about the weight of a rescue blanket. He tasted iron at the back of his throat each time he swallowed and felt the fabric catch at the scabbed places. He worked his jaw to ease pressure and kept eyes open in slices enough to mark the way the moon touched the bridge with a pewter wash enough to count Elias's breaths through the gag's rise and fall. Counting meant continuity. The men who set this table counted too. They had negotiated for silence and time. He could bargain with breath. Elias awakened as if surfacing through silt. A smell came first. The penny-fleck scent of blood. The dusty sweetness of old creosote, the ghost of motor oil where a truck had leached into ground in some other season. Then sound the thin, high-wire song of wind on metal. The distant murmuration of a generator somewhere in town, a coyote voicing a solitary opinion far up the ridge. Then weight wrists, bound shoulders bruised in a pattern that would paint itself in colors by morning ankles cinched hard enough to sizzle nerves. He kept eyes closed to let the world assemble before he faced it. When he opened the left, the right refused. Swelling had closed it into a purple lid. He found Ryan with a turn of his head and felt the relief that came like a low tide returning. They had worked pairs long enough that simple proximity built a scaffolding under the body. Ryan's eyes looked frost-bright and lucid. Elias looked away from the wound at the thigh and forced his attention to the steel diagonals above him, counting bolts and listening for irregularities in the bridge's complaints, because that gave the brain a task and kept panic from making itself a third presence under the abutment. "Count 10, Ryan said inside the gag and barely moved his mouth. It came out a smudged hum that still carried intention. Elias felt a smile begin at the corner of his good eye and settle before any muscle changed shape. 10 counted as a fence against noise. He breathed in shallow sips. He cut the air into rations like a man who had learned the art of shortage. The world sharpened toward the edges when he finished the first 10. Pain reintroduced itself with an air of grievance. He shifted the heel of one hand and felt plastic cut a white current along the nerve that ran to his little finger, a warning he shelved because options required injury down payments. The ravine looked like a memory of water. Rock had shaped the banks to hold it long ago, and then surrendered that duty to shade and wind. A narrow path traced the west side ropey with roots that clutched at earth and stood exposed where floods had once torn topsoil away. Up above at the lip, sage made pale islands. The underside of Ironshade looked like a skeleton with its skin peeled clean. Girders laddered away into shadow. Rivets sprouted like ancient seeds that would never sprout. Elias watched a moth twist through the cold and land on a bolt head as if it were dawn warm. The little life stayed there for a count of 7 and then lifted again, wobbled out into the rattle of weeds, vanished. He wanted water with a longing that simplified him into throat and tongue. He thought of the truck stop outside town where coffee sat under lights forever and yet tasted like fresh compromise, where he had argued with a map while Ryan ate a sandwich so neatly the wrapper looked ironed afterward. Silver Hollow did that to a person. It pressed patience into you by showing its own a place that had endured extraction and boom. And then the long drawdown of attention without losing the shape of itself. He had taken to the quiet faster than expected, walking at evening to read how shadows lay across lots and where dogs posted themselves behind fences, how elderly men sat two to a bench and spoke in numbers and weather, how the single stoplight blinked yellow like a heart with a long rest between beats. He climbed back to the present, the way you climb from a dream you want to preserve, careful with hands extended. Ryan tested bindings again in a way that felt less like struggle and more like exploration. The zip ties had the smooth resistance of quality stock, and whoever cinched them down had done it until plastic thinned and whined. He found no give in the knot at his ankles. He measured angles of leverage against the abutment's flange and filed ideas to the side like tools laid in order. A plan formed because plans grew where men like him put attention. It required a shift from stupor to function and an end to the bleeding he could not end. He lifted his gaze to Elias to send that plan over with a look. The transfer felt like passing a pack in a narrow chute. Elias nodded almost invisibly to say he held it. The cold made itself ceremonial. It arrived with each pause in the wind, as if a door swung open on a room kept for this, a chamber of iron air. It lay down and stayed. Fingers grew dull first, then bright with pain, then dulled again in a manner that worried Ryan more than the first bite. The gag tasted of old cloth and dirt and the sour of other hands. He swallowed and felt it abrade a new place. He allowed a memory to rise because it served purpose another night somewhere else. Mountains that kept their shape even against a black sky. A friend's breath slowing in his arms because shock had decided its numbers. He remembered the words, how they had sounded, even quiet. Stay with me, count with me, there is a next. He turned those lines now into a rhythm beneath his breath, a cadence that sat behind the gag. A drum nobody heard. Up on the roadway that no longer carried traffic, a wooden post clicked in a sleeve. It had widened with age. A sound that traveled down through the steel and into the bone. Elias thought of childhood storms that had banged gates and driven rain, flat across concrete in the city where he learned to read street corners, and then he let that story go because the present asked for totality. He took inventory. Eye blown. Jaw bruised, but hinge sound. Shoulder sprain grade 1, maybe 2. Wrist chafed. Still strong enough to bite plastic when the angle arrived. Ankle bound, circulation intact. Ribs one protested. Thirst immediate. Hope a thin wire tuned by wind still strung. He looked again at Ryan's leg. Blood had turned from red to rust, a small mercy, because it meant the worst flood had passed. The cloth around Ryan's mouth moved with each breath in steady measure. That steadiness served as heat in this furnace of cold. Elias fixed his attention there. The world sharpened along that line, less a blur and more a blueprint. 2 hours or 20 minutes, or all the time left, each felt equally accurate. The desert did that to a man bent clocks until they resembled something softer, a pouch rather than a gear. The moon advanced a width of a finger toward the ridge. Stars in the east brightened as if some hidden hand had turned a dimmer. The wind slacked. Silence grew large in the space it left. Out in the basin, a group of cattle shifted and pushed together as a single organism with many legs. A hum like a simmer rose and then flattened. A night bird crossed low and close, and its wings made a cloth-like sound, a thing familiar enough to reach into Ryan's chest and loosen something there. A knot of breath uncoiling, just enough that he could fill the lung again. He had placed a small object in his boot because preparation became habit when you knew the flavor of betrayal. His hand could not reach it now, and shouting the truth of it into the night meant feeding it to men who might listen. He settled for pressing his heel against the ground to feel the weight of that secret against bone, an assurance that even in this chosen helplessness he held a thread that tugged a much larger tapestry. A person does not always need to move to change where the world points. Sometimes you only have to keep something safe inside a quiet container and wait for the right palm to open. A coyote sang again closer. It did not gather a chorus. The call came thin and honest, a line cast into the black. Elias felt its sound in his teeth. He wanted to answer for the sake of ceremony. He kept the desire and filed it under the list of joys, postponed cold beer in summer, the slow haze after a run when lungs burn in a pleasant way, the simple weight of a watch ticking on the wrist. Ryan shifted to ease pressure off the wound and sent a lightning stripe from thigh to groin that whitewashed the rest of the world for a breath, and when sight returned, the bridge's lattice flared bright and then settled. He bit the cloth with molars to keep sound inside. He counted 3, and then 3 more, and then the odd comfort of prime numbers 5, 7, 11, because his mind liked the clean edges of math when flesh ragged. He found Elias again and gave a look that meant, carry some of this for me. Elias lifted his chin a fraction to say, already on it. Up on the lip of the ravine, something small moved and made a pitter against gravel, the kind of sound a lizard might manage when it scuttled from shade to shade. It stopped. The wind reached and smoothed the noise away. A smell arrived, faint then clearer, the sweet green of crushed sage and a trace of wet leather, as if someone had dampened a strap with breath. Elias turned his head toward that edge and held his eyes in that direction until they watered from cold. Nothing materialized. He told himself the scent came from a scrub brushed by wind. Silver Hollow slept the way small towns sleep, half-alert dog ears and mother ears tuned to the particular cries they answer a line. Cook, resting in a chair in the dark of his own kitchen, a deputy tracing a lazy 8 through streets he knew utterly, a nurse turning over in a twin bed because her body could never fully quit the habit of the next shift. Somewhere a radio murmured an AM lullaby. Somewhere a porch light swayed out a dim circle and a moth discovered its sun. Somewhere an old man woke with a start and remembered a name out loud and then smiled at the miracle of memory before it ran off again. Under Ironshade, 2 men leaned into steel and cold and each other's persistence. The desert wrote its slow messages around them, wind on metal toes of sage brushing rock. A sky so crowded with stars it seemed to tilt. Minutes collected like beads on a string. Breath made small clouds the air dissolved as offering. In the second, when stillness gathered its fullest shape, Elias heard it, a single quick scuff on the slope above gravel, trickling loose in a tiny cascade. Then silence again, like a held breath that waited for a cue. He turned his eye upward and held it there. The sound did not return. The wind climbed back through the lattice and plucked its note. Ryan's breathing measured again. The cold built another layer. The sky leaned closer as if the night had something it meant to confess and could not yet find the words. Far out across the basin, the faintest glimmer teased the ridge, a suggestion, rather than a promise, the first shy movement of a dawn, still hours away, although men under bridges do not trust glimmers. They trust the next breath and a plan with edges. Ryan shifted his shoulders against the abutment and felt steel steady him. Elias flexed fingers until blood returned with a sting that counted as a kind of victory. Somewhere above, gravel ticked once more, slow and deliberate, as if a small foot tested the slope. The desert listened to itself. The bridge hummed to no one. Two men waited beneath its ribs, bound in plastic and breath. And the night paused at the edge of the ravine, the way a story pauses before the next voice enters a heartbeat, before prints press into dust. The outskirts of Silver Hollow lay like a quilt stitched from scrubland and slow-moving dirt roads, the kind of place where the town's hum faded into the background, and the desert began to breathe on its own again. Out here, fences leaned from years of wind cactus paddles, rose like green hands from the dust, and houses hunkered low-built, more for endurance than for show. The Dawson property sat at the edge of this borderland, a single-story adobe, with a faded red roof, a yard ringed by chicken wire, and the smell of mesquite smoke lingering from a breakfast fire. Mira Dawson knew the rhythms of this place by heart. At 11, she had already learned the pace of mornings here, the sound of her grandfather Grant's boots scraping the porch as he carried his mug of black coffee out to watch the horizon. The creak of the gate when the mailman leaned through to drop letters on the worn bench. The occasional caw of a raven claiming the telephone pole as its own. Grant Dawson carried his past the way a well-used tool carries the shine of many hands, quietly with a familiarity that didn't demand attention but would show itself when needed. Once he'd been a military field medic, moving through sand and smoke with a rucksack full of life-saving instruments and a head full of protocols drilled by necessity. Now, decades later, the war was far behind him, but its discipline had settled into his bones. His back was straighter than most men his age, his eyes quick to assess any living thing in distress, and his hands as steady over a dog's sutures as they had once been over a soldier's wound. Since his retirement, Grant had run a small veterinary clinic out of a converted garage on the property. Animals of all kinds passed through: barn cats with torn ears, cattle dogs with cactus spines in their paws, the occasional injured hawk brought in by someone from the Wildlife Service. But the most recent arrivals were different. Ash and Ember were German Shepherd pups, 6 months old, rescued from an overcrowded shelter 3 counties over. They had been found huddled together under a collapsed shed on the edge of a dry wash, half-starved but still protective of each other. When Grant first brought them home, their ribs had shown in delicate arcs beneath their fur. But their eyes, Ash's a clear amber embers, a deep brown, had already begun to burn with the sharp light of curiosity. They were inseparable shadows and mirrors of each other. Ash was the bolder one, always a step ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging like a metronome set too fast. Ember followed close but was the thinker, tilting his head at every new sound, as if measuring its intent. Together they turned the Dawson yard into a training ground, chasing each other between the mesquite trees, splashing in the shallow metal trough. Grant kept filled for the chickens, or curling up in a shared heap under the porch when the heat became too much. Mira loved them with the unreserved devotion only a child and an animal can give each other. Every morning before school, she fed them from matching metal bowls, checking that Ash didn't steal Ember's portion, and every afternoon, she led them through the makeshift obstacle course Grant had set up with hay bales and sawhorses. She spoke to them constantly, as if the 3 of them were co-conspirators in some grand secret plan. That day, the sky had the kind of pale high clouds that meant the heat would linger well into evening. Mira sat cross-legged in the patchy shade near the chicken hutch, her sketchbook open on her knees. She was halfway through drawing the telephone pole across the road, carefully shading the frayed wires, and the raven perched on top when she noticed Ash had gone still. At first it was subtle. The constant sound of his nails ticking against the hard ground stopped. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. A moment later, Ember mirrored him, his playful pant replaced by a low, closed-mouth breath. Both dogs stared past the fence toward the far horizon, where the land dipped and rose again in the vague outline of the ravine. Mira lowered her pencil. "What is it?" she asked softly, glancing over her shoulder toward the empty dirt road. Neither dog moved. Their bodies had gone taut, the kind of alertness that erased the usual fluidity of puppyhood. Ash's tail stiffened. Ember's weight shifted to his hind legs as if ready to spring. Grant, who was bent over by the porch, fixing a loose hinge on the screen door, didn't notice. The only sounds were the hum of a distant cicada and the faint rattle of the wind through the dry grass. Then Ash took a step forward, pressing his nose against the chicken wire. Ember followed, eyes locked on the same unseen point beyond the ridge. Without warning, Ash shoved against a section of the fence where the latch hadn't been hooked properly after Mira's morning chores. The wire sagged just enough for him to squeeze through. Mira scrambled to her feet. Ember hesitated for a heartbeat, looking back at her, and then pushed through the gap after his brother. The wire squealed softly as it flexed, then snapped back into place, the opening gone unless someone knew exactly where to push. Mira's heart thudded. No, come back," she called, but her voice carried no authority over whatever had gripped their instincts. The pups broke into a run, their bodies' low movements coordinated as if they'd rehearsed this chase for weeks. Dust kicked up behind them in little gold clouds. They didn't look back. She hesitated for a breath, torn between chasing after them immediately and running to tell her grandfather. Grant would say it was safer to let the dogs work out their chase and return on their own. But Mira had lived with them long enough to know this wasn't a game. Their bodies weren't loose with play. They were streamlined, focused. The direction they'd taken, the southwest corner of the property, pointed almost directly toward the Ironshade bridge. Mira knew the bridge mostly as a silhouette in the distance, a place her grandfather told her to avoid. Too many ways to twist an ankle down there, he'd warned, and too many places where no one would hear you if you called. The thought made her throat tighten. She imagined Ash and Ember slipping among the sage and brittle stones, following whatever scent had caught their attention. Coyotes sometimes prowled out there at dusk. Snakes, too, though it was late in the season for them to be active. And yet the pull on the pups was so strong that not even Mira's voice could break it. From her spot in the yard, she could still see their small shapes crest the first rise. Then they disappeared behind the swell of land that rolled toward the ravine. The afternoon light seemed to sharpen around her the colors of the desert, turning more intense, the yellowed grass nearly white in the glare, the rust on the chicken wire deepening to a coppery red. Mira realized she was holding her breath. She darted toward the porch. "Grandpa," she began, but the words snagged in her mouth. She could picture him dropping his tools, frowning, telling her to stay put while he went after them. And if whatever drew Ash and Ember was dangerous, they would be alone until he got there. Her gaze flicked back to the sagging section of fence. She imagined the pups already a quarter-mile away, their paw prints fresh in the powdery earth, the scent still in their noses. If she moved fast, she might catch up before they got too far. Mira grabbed the sketchbook and pencil, shoved them into her denim satchel, then paused. She opened the back door just wide enough to slip inside and crossed to the coat rack. Hanging from the lowest hook was the old olive-green canvas satchel that had once been Grant's field medic bag. He kept it stocked for emergencies: gauze rolls, adhesive bandages, antiseptic wipes, a small flashlight, 2 foil emergency blankets, and a half-used roll of athletic tape. She had helped him restock it enough times to know exactly what was inside. She slung it across her body, the strap long enough to bump against her hip, and stepped back out into the yard. The sunlight had shifted while she was inside, leaning toward the warmer tones of late afternoon. Shadows stretched from the porch posts toward the fence like reaching fingers. Mira crouched at the gap in the wire and pushed it open, just enough to slide through. The air outside the fence smelled different, less of chicken feed and sun-baked wood, more of dust and open space. The breeze carried the faint scent of creosote and something sharper she couldn't quite place. She straightened and scanned the land ahead. The pup's tracks were easy to spot, 2 sets of small, deep paw prints side by side, cutting through the grass toward the rise. She set off after them, her sneakers whispering over the dry earth satchel, bouncing against her side. As she reached the base of the slope, the house behind her already felt a world away. The sound of the yard faded until the only noises were her own breathing and the occasional rustle of wind in the brush. Ahead, the land seemed to hold its breath, the openness narrowing into the shallow folds that led toward the ravine. Mira's legs burned as she climbed the rise. At the top, she stopped and shaded her eyes. Far ahead, maybe 200 yards, Ash's pale-tipped tail flashed in the sunlight as he crested another ridge, Ember close on his heels. They were still heading southwest toward the distant dark line that marked the Ironshade bridge. The sight tightened something in her chest, but it also hardened her resolve. She adjusted the strap of the medic bag and started down the other side of the slope, following the trail of paw prints deeper into the waiting land. The storm, she realized, was not in the sky. It was already moving on the ground, carried in the urgency of 2 young dogs running towards something only they could smell. And whether she liked it or not, she was now part of its path. Mira stood at the crest of the first low hill. The hem of her denim jacket fluttering in the growing wind, her breath hitching as she tried to pick out the movement of the 2 pups across the scrub. The last flash of Ash's pale tail and Ember's darker haunch had vanished into the sloping folds of the land. She adjusted the strap of her grandfather's medic bag across her chest, the canvas pressing reassuringly against her ribs, and took her first step off the ridge toward wherever they were going. She had never been this far from the house alone, not on foot, not without telling Grant. The thought of turning back tugged at her for the length of a single breath. He'd be angry, maybe worried sick, but then the image of the pups running not in play, but in purpose burned through her hesitation. Whatever had called them out here wasn't something they'd ignore, and that meant she couldn't either. The desert under her sneakers was a patchwork of brittle grass and hard-packed clay, the surface so dry it crumbled in places under her weight. Low mesquite branches reached for her sleeves, snagging threads if she passed too close, and thorny cholla cacti glimmered in the waning light like something alive. She picked her way carefully, scanning for the paw prints, 2 sets side by side, at first, then splitting as Ash took the lead and Ember trailed. The sky above had shifted without her noticing. The soft gold of late afternoon was draining into something sharper, amber bleeding toward copper, and at the edges, the first strokes of violet. The air cooled in a way that seemed to come from the ground up, a breath rising from the earth to brush her skin, bringing with it the faint mineral tang of dust disturbed by running paws. By the time she reached the next rise, she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She paused, tilted her head, and there it was, faint but distinct, a short-clipped bark. Ash. It came again, followed by a thinner sound, a high-pitched whine that could only be Ember. They were somewhere ahead, maybe beyond the shallow gully that ran along the north side of the ravine. "Hold on," she murmured to no one but herself, and started down. The gully floor was littered with stones, smoothed by water that hadn't run here in years. The descent forced her to half-slide, half-step shoe, crunching on loose gravel. At the bottom, the air was cooler, still edged with a dampness that felt out of place in the Mojave. She ducked under a crooked branch, climbed the opposite slope, and emerged into another stretch of open ground, wider this time, the grass thinner and the soil paler, as if leached by long seasons of sun. Up ahead, the land tilted toward the southwest. The horizon there was darker, a jagged interruption in the otherwise smooth line of the desert. Mira squinted and made out the faint silhouette of the Ironshade bridge. Even from this distance, it had an odd presence, its rusted trusses rising out of the earth like the bones of some long-buried creature, its deck long unused, but still spanning the gap over the ravine, like a stubborn survivor. She had only ever seen it from far away when riding in Grant's truck, and always in daylight. Now, with the sun sinking behind her, the bridge seemed to collect the shadows rather than block them. The steel framework caught what little light was left flashing in places where the rust had flaked thin. The wind moved through its hollow spaces and produced a low, drawn-out groan that made the fine hairs on Mira's arms rise. Another bark, louder this time. It echoed oddly, bouncing off the metal and stone, so it was hard to tell exactly where it had come from. Mira tightened her grip on the strap of the medic bag and pushed forward. The ground grew rougher as she approached. Clusters of sage and rabbit brush crowded the path, releasing sharp scents as she brushed past. Once she snagged her jeans on a barbed twig and had to stop to tug free her fingers, coming away with a thin smear of dust and sap. The wind was stronger here and colder. It tugged at her braid, sent a loose thread of hair across her cheek, and whistled through the taller grass like someone whispering a warning she couldn't quite make out. She angled down another slope, following a narrow trail where the pup's paw prints were pressed deep into the powdery soil. Her legs ached, but she didn't slow. The barking came again, 2 sharp bursts, a pause, then a growl that rumbled low and steady. "Ash, Ember," she called, her voice carrying further than she expected in the thinning air. The sound seemed to vanish into the space ahead, swallowed by the bridge's shadow. The last of the sunlight had given way to the dusky in-between. The steel of Ironshade was now only a silhouette. The details blurred into a lattice of black against the deepening blue of the sky. A sliver of moon had risen to the east, pale and cold, and it caught on the edges of the trusses like frost. Mira's breath clouded faintly in front of her as she closed the last stretch of ground to the base of the ravine. From here, the bridge loomed overhead, its underside a grid of beams and rusted bolts. The wind funneled through the structure, and the resulting creak was almost like a voice, long tired but unbroken. She slowed, scanning for movement. Her eyes adjusted to the dim picking out shapes in the shadow. The rounded forms of boulders, the jagged sticks of old brush, the wide dark opening beneath the far end of the bridge where the ravine deepened. Then there, a flash of movement to her right. Ash stood halfway up the slope on the far side, his stance rigid, ears forward, tail held out behind him like a counterbalance. He barked once sharp, then looked back toward something lower in the ravine. Ember's head appeared beside his, and the younger pup let out a quick, uneasy yip. Mira stepped forward instinctively, the medic bag shifting against her side. The ground at the lip of the ravine gave way to loose shale and dirt, and she had to plant her feet carefully. The barking stopped, replaced by a strange silence, broken only by the wind's moan through the bridge. She cupped her hands to her mouth. "I'm here," she called, but the words felt thin in the vast space. Ash gave another bark, then descended a few steps toward whatever held his focus. Ember followed his growl, low and constant now. The sound sent a prickle up Mira's spine. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that something down there mattered. She edged closer to the slope, testing the ground with each footstep. The medic in her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. "Watch your footing, don't rush what you can't see." But urgency pulled her onward. The air changed as she began to climb down. It grew cooler, denser, with a faint metallic scent that reminded her of the times she'd helped Grant clean his old tools. The last light from the sky barely reached this far, and shadows pooled thick around the base of the abutments. Halfway down, she paused, one hand gripping a jut of rock, and looked across. Beyond Ash and Ember's alert forms, in the deepest shadow beneath the bridge, something shifted. A shape larger than she expected, still but not lifeless, stirred against the ground. The sound that followed was muffled, as if caught behind cloth, but unmistakable, a human voice, raw and faint, calling out. Her pulse kicked hard. She glanced at the pups. Ash looked at her once briefly, then back at the shadow, his tail giving a single sharp wag, as if to say, "Here, here, here." Ember's growl deepened. Mira tightened her grip on the medic bag and began the last descent into the ravine. The wind above pushed through the bridge again, the rusted metal answering in a long, tired creak. Somewhere in its voice, she imagined she could hear her own steps, her own breath, joining the story the desert was telling tonight. The sun was gone now, and the cold was settling in for good. But the barks and warning growls ahead told her she had found them, or rather that they had found something. And whatever it was, she was about to see it for herself. Mira's sneakers slipped on the loose shale as she reached the bottom of the ravine, the sound of tiny stones skittering ahead of her into the darkness. The air here was cooler, edged with that same faint metallic tang she'd noticed before, and thick enough that each breath seemed to linger in her chest. The beamwork of the Ironshade bridge loomed overhead, a black lattice against the deep indigo sky, its rusted joints groaning quietly as the wind threaded through. Ash stood between her and a shape on the ground, his body tense, head low, hackles up not in aggression, but in an instinctive guarding posture. Ember was crouched on the other side of the figure, eyes flicking between the shadowed slopes and the still form, as if daring anything to come closer. It took Mira's eyes a moment to adjust. The shape resolved into a man sprawled on his side, one knee bent awkwardly beneath him. His jacket and tactical pants were torn in several places, the fabric at his thigh soaked through with something dark that glistened even in the dim light. His face was pale under a smear of dirt, a day's worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. A length of fabric had been knotted roughly across his mouth, though it hung loose enough for him to breathe. Mira's stomach tightened. She knew without needing her grandfather's voice in her head that this was bad, worse than bad. She crouched beside Ash, murmuring, "It's okay, boy. I'm here," before inching forward. The man's eyes fluttered open at the movement. Up close, she could see they were a clear, washed-out blue, but clouded with pain. He blinked slowly, focusing on her with visible effort. His lips moved beneath the gag, and a sound came out, a hoarse, broken rasp. It wasn't a word she recognized at first, but when he tried again, she caught it. "Help us." Her gaze snapped to the shadows behind him, and that's when she saw the second body. 10 feet away, half hidden by the curve of the abutment, another man lay on his back. His head was tilted at an awkward angle, eyes closed, skin ghostly under the smudges of dirt and bruising. His wrists were bound in front of him with a thick nylon cord, and a gag like the first man's was tied crooked across his mouth. For a moment, all Mira could hear was her own breathing and the slow, steady thump of her heart. The first man, Ryan, she'd learn later, shifted slightly, and the motion seemed to cost him. Ash pressed closer to his side, sniffing near the bloodied fabric at his thigh. Ember padded toward the second man, sniffed his face, and whined softly. Mira dropped the medic bag to the ground and unzipped it with shaking fingers. "Okay, okay," she whispered, half to herself, half to them. "I can do this." She'd patched up scraped knees and chicken-scratch cuts, wrapped bandages around sprained joints for Grant's patients when he needed an extra hand. But this was something else entirely. She pulled out the small pair of scissors Grant always kept tucked in a side pocket and began cutting away the gag on the first man. He didn't resist, only turned his head slightly to the side as the cloth fell away. His breath came out in a ragged exhale, and she could see the lines of strain etched into his face. "What happened?" she asked, though she wasn't sure he could answer. His mouth moved, and this time the words were clearer, though still barely above a whisper. "Ambush. Tide. Elias." He coughed, grimaced. "You need to hurry, Elias." The second man, Mira glanced over. Ember was sitting beside him now, ears pricked, tail still. The man's chest rose and fell. But slowly, too slowly. "I'll come back to you," she told Ryan, and crawled over to the second man. His skin felt cold when she touched his cheek. She found the knife in the Kit Grant's old folding blade, its handle worn smooth and sawed carefully at the nylon binding his wrists. It took longer than she wanted. The cord was tight enough to have bitten into the skin, leaving deep, angry grooves. When the last strand snapped, his arms sagged forward limp. Mira worked quickly to ease the gag off his mouth. His breathing hitched shallow. But there. Relief flooded her chest. Though it lasted only a heartbeat, this was still a razor's edge. Back at Ryan's side, she focused on the worst wound, the dark patch at his thigh. She tore open a packet of gauze pads, pressing them hard against the soaked fabric. He flinched, but didn't make a sound. She wrapped the bandage roll around and around, until it held tight just like Grant had shown her. "You're gonna be okay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Both of you." Ryan's gaze followed her movements, sharp despite the pain. "Phone?" he asked. She fumbled for the old flip phone in the bag, the one her grandfather had insisted she carry. Flipping it open, she pressed the power button and watched the small green light blink to life. Her relief lasted half a second, then she saw the screen. No signal. She stood and moved a few steps up the slope, holding the phone high, turning in a slow circle. Nothing. The walls of the ravine might as well have been the walls of a cave. The town could have been on another planet for all the connections she had here. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she lowered the phone. The weight of it settled in her chest. No one knew she was out, and these two men had no one else. If they stayed in the ravine through the night, the cold alone could finish what their injuries had started. She looked back at the pups. Ash stood over Ryan now, tail wagging once, as their eyes met. Ember returned to her side, his gaze flicking from her to the bridge overhead, as if suggesting something. "Okay," she murmured, crouching to stroke Ember's head, then Ash's. "We need help. I can't get a signal here, but maybe you can get someone to come." Ryan's voice reached her again, rough and low. "Can't. Leave him," he said, nodding toward Elias. "I won't," Mira promised. She looked at the pups, her heart hammering. "Ash, Ember, go find help." For a moment, they just stared at her, ears forward, waiting for more. She pointed up the slope. "Go!" Ash moved first, bounding toward the incline, Ember on his heels. They scrambled up loose dirt, sliding under their paws, then disappeared into the shadow beyond the ravine's lip. Mira turned back to Ryan and Elias. The cold was sinking deeper now, the kind that didn't just bite at the skin, but seemed to settle into muscle and bone. She grabbed one of the foil emergency blankets from the bag and spread it over Elias, tucking it close around his shoulders. She gave Ryan the other, pressing it around him, despite his murmured protest. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of a bark, distant but clear. Mira closed her eyes for a second and pictured the pups running across the open land toward the outskirts of Silver Hollow, toward anyone who might hear them. She didn't know how long it would take, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't leaving. Not now. Not until help came. She adjusted the gauze at Ryan's thigh, checked Elias's breathing again, and sat down between them, the medic bag open beside her like a lifeline. The bridge groaned overhead. The wind whispered through the sage, and in the deep cold of the ravine, Mira kept her vigil. Ash was the first to vanish from Mira's sight, his sable and cream blur swallowed by the jagged lip of the ravine. Ember lingered for half a heartbeat, eyes fixed on her face, as if memorizing it, before he turned and bounded after his brother. The sound of their paws on shale-sharp clicks, short scrabbles rose and fell, until it was replaced by the muffled thud of their footfalls on the hardpack above. The air outside the ravine was sharper colder. Both pups paused at the top ears, pivoting, nostrils flaring. The scents were layered wind-scoured sage, the mineral tang of rusted iron from the bridge, the faint animal musk of rabbits and coyotes that had crossed here in the last day. Underneath it all, almost hidden, was something older: oil and dust and the ghost smell of canvas. Echo Post. Grant had taken them there once on a day when the air smelled of coming rain. He'd driven the truck over the northern ridge and stopped in front of a squat concrete structure half swallowed by sand. While Mira explored the empty rooms, Grant had led the pups to the heavy red rope that dangled from the siren box. He'd knelt between them, rubbed their ears, and given a single tug. The noise that followed was like lightning in sound, startling, enormous, echoing through the canyons. This, he'd told them, voice steady, means help is coming. Ash turned his head toward the northwest now, the way memory pulled him. Ember pressed his nose to the wind, catching the same faint trace, and gave a short, eager yip. Without another hesitation, they started running. The first obstacle was the ridge itself. From the ravine's lip, the ground rose in a steep, rock-strewn slope, dotted with tufts of brittle grass and thin-boned yucca. Ash took the lead, weaving between the larger boulders, claws digging in for purchase. Ember followed his smaller frame, giving him an edge on the narrow paths between stone outcroppings. Loose pebbles cascaded down behind them, but they didn't stop. At the top, the view opened into a stretch of pale sand dunes, rippled by the wind. In daylight, the dunes might have looked almost gentle. But under the moon's thin light, they were stark, their edges sharp as blades. The cold was different here, dry and needling, slipping between the guard hairs of their coats to lick at their skin. Ash bounded forward, paws sinking in the first ridge of sand. Each step was a choice between speed and traction. They found a rhythm, pushing forward in short bursts, letting momentum carry them up the slopes, then bounding down the other sides. Ember's breath puffed in quick clouds, his ears flattening each time the wind gusted hard enough to sting his eyes. A rabbit darted from behind a sage bush at the edge of a dune, bolting into the darkness. Ash's instincts twitched, but he kept his course, glancing at Ember to make sure his brother stayed close. They had a mission. The dunes gave way to a flatter expanse of gravelly soil, where the wind had stripped away the top layer of sand. Here, the scent of Echo Post grew clearer, old machine oil and the faint char of long-extinguished fires. Ash slowed briefly, letting his nose hover just above the ground, then veered left toward the darker outline of the northern ridge. Ember matched his pace, their paws now making a softer crunching sound on the compacted earth. The ridge rose slowly at first, then steepened. The pups climbed in switchbacks, using narrow deer trails etched into the slope. Twice they had to stop when loose stones gave way beneath their paws, sending them sliding a few feet before they dug in and pushed upward again. Halfway up, a coyote's call split the night, a high, wavering note that hung in the air like a warning. Ash froze, ears pricked, eyes scanning the shadows. Ember moved closer, his shoulder brushing his brother's. The call came again, farther off this time. And they resumed their climb faster now, their muscles warming against the cold. At the top, they were met with a blast of wind strong enough to make them squint. The land beyond sloped gently down into a shallow basin, and there, almost blending into the color of the ground, squatted Echo Post. Its walls were scabbed with peeling paint, and one of its windows still held a single shard of glass that flashed in the moonlight like an unblinking eye. Ash trotted ahead, tail lifting slightly, his pace quickening as the scent grew stronger. Ember followed, weaving around patches of prickly pear. The building loomed larger with each bound until they reached its shadow. The siren box was mounted high on the outer wall, its once bright red paint dulled to a rust-streaked maroon. The rope dangled from its base, frayed at the end, swaying slightly in the wind. Ash sat back on his haunches, looking up at it, ears tilted forward. Ember mirrored him, panting lightly, then glanced at his brother. Ash moved first, leaping upward to catch the rope between his teeth. It resisted stiff from years of disuse, the fibers biting against his gums. He growled low and pulled his hind legs, scrabbling for better purchase on the concrete. The rope shifted an inch, then stopped. Ember darted forward, rising on his hind legs to grip the rope just below Ash's jaws. Together they pulled, one bracing, the other yanking. The rope gave another inch, then another. A deep mechanical groan vibrated through the wall. Ash let go, dropping back to the ground, and Ember adjusted his grip higher. He jerked his head down hard, and somewhere inside, the box gears, long asleep, began to turn. The sound was strained, as if the machine had to remember how to move. Ash jumped up again, their teeth catching in tandem, and they yanked as one. The siren's first cry was a warbling moan, uncertain, like a voice clearing its throat after a long silence. Then it caught the pitch rising until it became a piercing wail that rolled out across the basin. It echoed off the ridge, spilled into the valleys, and carried into the cold desert night like a blade of sound. Ash dropped back, chest heaving, and Ember stepped away, ears swiveling as the noise filled the air. They stood side by side, their breath puffing in the moonlight, listening as the siren's call stretched far beyond what their eyes could see. Somewhere out there, they knew Mira was waiting in the ravine. Somewhere out there, someone would hear. The wind whipped around Echo Post, but the pups stayed where they were until the siren began to fade into a steady, keening tone. Only then did Ash turn his head toward the direction they'd come, his ears pricking at the thought of returning. Ember stepped forward, touching his nose to his brother's shoulder. They would go back as soon as they were sure the message had been sent. Above them, the siren wailed on a sound too loud for the quiet desert, too urgent to ignore. It was the voice of a place that had been silent too long. And now, because two small lives had remembered a lesson from an old man, it was awake again. The siren's scream cut through the desert night like a blade of steel drawn across glass, high, urgent, impossible to mistake. Miles away, in a small house tucked against the southern edge of Silver Hollow, Clara Haynes froze halfway through, tightening the straps on her pack. She had been preparing for a routine early morning gear check, not expecting anything more demanding than paperwork in the morning, but that sound she had heard it only once before, years ago, during a wildfire drill. The mechanical voice of Echo Post had not spoken since. Clara dropped the strap, crossed the living room in 3 long strides, and flicked the light switch by the door. Her truck keys were already in her pocket. On the other side of town, Grant Dawson had been halfway through cleaning a set of bandage shears in his small clinic when the noise reached him. It arrived as a distant trembling note at first, then grew until it seemed to press against the walls. His hands went still. For a moment, the years fell away. He was back in the field under a different sky, hearing the distinct pitch of a medic's whistle, an old signal that something was wrong, very wrong. He didn't need anyone to tell him what that siren meant. Grant moved quickly, pulling on his heavy flannel jacket and grabbing the battered green duffel that lived by the door. His eyes flicked to the worn leash hanging on the hook, empty. Ash and Ember weren't here. A cold thought cut through him, Mira. Outside, Clara's truck was already rumbling into view, headlights bouncing over the uneven track toward his gate. She stopped just long enough for him to climb in the duffel, thumping against the floorboard. "Echo Post," she asked, her voice low but sharp. Grant nodded once. "It's them. Has to be." Neither wasted time on what them meant. Clara swung the truck back toward the road, the tires crunching over gravel before catching the hard-packed clay. The siren still keened behind them, its voice carried by the wind, echoing through the canyons as they headed north. The desert at night was not forgiving. Even with the headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the dark, the road seemed to shift beneath them. Patches of loose sand stealing traction, shallow ruts jerking the steering wheel. Clara handled each with the calm precision of someone who had driven in worse. Her hands were steady, her eyes locked on the road ahead. But her mind was already tracing the fastest route to Ironshade. Beside her, Grant checked his bag by feel thermal blankets, water pressure dressings, trauma shears, a compact oxygen kit. He tried not to picture Mira out here in the cold, but the thought came anyway, small hands clutching at the strap of his old medic bag, that stubborn tilt of her chin when she'd decided something needed doing. Under Ironshade Bridge, the cold had deepened into something with weight. It settled over Mira's shoulders like wet cloth seeping past her jacket, crawling down her arms until her fingers felt slow and clumsy. She shifted on the hard ground, trying to keep blood moving, but didn't dare leave either man for more than a second. Ryan lay propped against a slant of concrete, the foil emergency blanket rustling faintly with each shallow breath. His eyes were open, but hazy, fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. Every few minutes she spoke to him, not much, just enough to tether him to the moment. "You're still with me," she said quietly. "You have to stay with me." He would blink slow and deliberate, as if each movement had to fight its way past pain. Elias was worse. The blanket covered him to the chin, but Mira could feel the cold in his skin whenever she touched his face. His breathing was faint, the rise and fall of his chest barely disturbing the blanket. She reached under it to find his hand wrapping her smaller fingers around his and squeezing gently. "You're not alone," she whispered, echoing something she'd once heard her grandfather say to a frightened animal on his clinic table. "I'm here." The minutes stretched, marked only by the distant moan of the siren, fainter now, but still there like a thread pulled tight between here and hope. Mira checked the gauze on Ryan's thigh, again adjusting the pressure when she saw fresh blood seeping through. He didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened briefly. Somewhere above, the wind pushed through the bridge's trusses, producing a long, low groan that seemed to settle into the bones of the structure. She imagined it was the bridge's way of keeping watch with her, of standing guard over these three people bound together for the moment by circumstance. She glanced toward the slope where Ash and Ember had disappeared. Every few breaths, she thought she heard something pause on rock, maybe, or just the shifting of loose gravel in the wind. But nothing came of it. Her phone still sat useless in the medic bag, a reminder of how far they were from any signal. She had tried moving higher on the slope earlier, but the lightheadedness that followed had sent her back down before she could even try calling. She couldn't risk leaving Ryan and Elias alone for that long again. Instead, she focused on what she could do: keep them warm, keep them awake when possible, and wait. Ryan stirred suddenly, his gaze sharpening as if he'd caught something in the air. "What is it?" Mira asked. "Sound," he murmured. His voice was rough, nearly swallowed by the wind. "Truck. Maybe." She held her breath, listening. At first she heard only the usual desert sounds, wind in the sage, the faint tick of cooling metal above. But then far off there was a new note. Low, rhythmic. Tires on gravel. Her heart jumped. She stood quickly, moving to the edge of the slope where the moonlight spilled across the ground. The sound grew clearer, an engine pushing hard over uneven terrain. Back under the bridge, she dropped to her knees beside Elias, touching his cheek again. "Hold on," she told him. "Help's coming." The siren's voice began to fade at last, replaced by the approaching growl of the truck. Mira's pulse raced as headlights swept briefly over the ridgeline, vanished, then appeared again closer this time. She thought of Ash and Ember, small shapes in the vast dark leading someone here. The relief that swelled in her chest was almost too much to hold, but she kept her hand steady, her voice calm. They weren't safe yet. She looked at Ryan, saw the faintest shadow of a smile in the corner of his mouth, and for the first time since climbing down into the ravine, she let herself believe they might all see morning. Up above, the sound of the engine deepened as it descended toward the bridge. The beam of a flashlight cut briefly across the slope, searching. Mira raised her arm and waved, her voice breaking free in a shout that the wind carried upward. Down here, the light fixed on her steady now. Footsteps followed, firm, fast, purposeful. Help had found them. The cold was still here, the night still deep, but its hold had begun to loosen. Somewhere on the ridge, the last echo of the siren faded into silence. The glare of headlights spilled over the rim of the ravine, like a sudden sunrise turning the jagged edges of rock into silver and shadow. Mira squinted against the brightness, her arm still raised in a wide arc to signal. The low growl of the engine deepened as the vehicle crept closer to the edge, tires crunching over loose stone. "Grandpa," she shouted, her voice breaking halfway through the word. The truck stopped, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Then a figure appeared in the light, tall and solid, framed against the halo of the beams. Grant Dawson's voice carried down first, steady, but tinged with relief. Mira. She didn't remember climbing. One moment she was at the bottom, the next she was halfway up, boots scraping for purchase, hands grabbing at rock. Grant met her before she could reach the top, crouching low to pull her the last few feet into his arms. "You're freezing," he murmured, holding her tight against the coarse fabric of his jacket. His chest rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I found them." Mira managed her voice, muffled against his shoulder. "Two men hurt bad under the bridge." Grant eased back just enough to look at her face. In the beam of Clara's flashlight, her cheeks were pale except for the windburn along her jaw, her hair tangled with dust and sage needles. But her eyes were steady. "You did good," he said quietly, then glanced over her shoulder. "Clara, we need to move." Clara Haynes was already there, her rescue pack slung over one shoulder, the other hand adjusting the beam of her flashlight toward the slope. "Show me," she said. Mira led the way back down, Grant right behind her, Clara following with the sure-footedness of someone who'd climbed into worse places in worse conditions. The beam of the flashlight danced over the ravine wall, catching the metallic glint of the bridge overhead, before settling on the two figures curled against the concrete abutment. Ryan blinked against the light, but didn't move, the emergency blanket pulled tight around him. Elias lay motionless beside him, his face ashen under a scatter of bruises. Grant dropped to his knees beside Ryan, first setting his duffel down with a practiced motion. "Gunshot," he asked, his eyes already on the blood-darkened bandage at Ryan's thigh. "Blunt trauma," and tearing Clara answered after a quick glance. "We'll check depth after we stabilize." She moved to Elias, kneeling to feel for a pulse at his neck. "Weak, but there," she said. "Hypothermic. We need to get heat packs on him now." Mira knelt near the medic bag she'd carried all this way, opening it for her grandfather. "I tried to keep pressure on his leg," she told him, nodding toward Ryan. "And I gave them blankets." Grant's hand paused for the briefest moment, just long enough to rest on her shoulder. "You bought them time," he said. "That's no small thing." From the darkness above, a soft scrabble of paws on rock announced new arrivals. Ash and Ember slid down the slope, moving slower than usual, their chests heaving with the effort. Their coats were dusted with sand, their ears pricked but drooping at the tips from exhaustion. "They made it," Mira said, her voice soft with pride. Ash padded straight to Ryan, sniffing at the bandage as if to confirm the situation hadn't changed. Ember took up a post a few feet away, his gaze sweeping the edges of the ravine, the little rise of his hackles, proof that, tired or not, he would still challenge anything that came too close. Clara set a pair of chemical heat packs under Elias's arms and at his chest, then wrapped another blanket around him. "Grant, you ready to move, Ryan? Let's splint him in place first." Grant set his hands steady as he secured the makeshift dressing Mira had applied. He glanced at her again. "Textbook," he murmured, almost to himself. The sound of the truck engine idling above was a reminder of how far they still were from safety. But under the bridge, the sharp edge of urgency had softened into something steadier, Focused, controlled. They had light supplies, trained hands, and they had each other. Mira sat back on her heels, letting the warmth of the moment settle in, even as the cold pressed harder against her skin. Above her, the rusted skeleton of Ironshade creaked, but for the first time all night, it didn't sound lonely. Mira shifted to help Grant adjust the emergency blanket around Ryan's shoulders when her fingers brushed against the heavy leather of his boot. The movement must have jarred it slightly because she heard a faint rattle inside. Not the sound of loose pebbles or sand, but something more deliberate enclosed. She hesitated, glancing up at Ryan. His eyes were half-lidded, his breathing slow but even. "I think there's something in here," she murmured to Grant. Grant's brow furrowed. "Careful." Working gently so as not to jostle his injured leg, Mira unfastened the bootlace, tugging it free until the top could loosen. Inside the thick lining at the ankle, her fingers found a stitched flap, barely visible in the dim light. She pulled at it and felt a tiny snap as the seam gave way. A slim metallic rectangle slid into her palm. Even before she held it up to the flashlight, she knew it was a USB drive, black with no markings, the kind that carried secrets you didn't want falling into the wrong hands. Grant's gaze sharpened. "Where did you... in his boot?" Mira said, her voice low. Clara, kneeling nearby, caught the words. "Let me see." She took the drive, turning it between her fingers. "This isn't the kind you carry by accident?" Ryan stirred, opening his eyes just enough to focus on Clara. His lips moved, but only a rasp emerged. Grant leaned in to catch it. "Evidence. Smuggling." "Keep safe," Ryan whispered, before slipping back into the haze of pain and exhaustion. The weight of the object in Clara's hand seemed to double. She knew what to do. Digging her radio from her vest pocket, she switched frequencies and called in her voice crisp and direct. "Sheriff Briggs, this is Clara Haynes at Ironshade. We've recovered 2 injured federal personnel and a storage device of possible evidentiary value. Request immediate law enforcement response." Copy. Static crackled, then a deep, measured voice replied, "Copy that, Clara. Stay put. I'm sending a team to secure the scene. ETA 20 minutes. Sheriff Damon Briggs wasn't just the law in Silver Hollow. He'd been a fixture for decades, the kind of man whose reputation was built on a blend of stubborn tenacity and an instinct for reading trouble before it happened. If Clara had called him directly, it meant the situation was heavier than most rescue runs. Mira glanced between them, unsure how much she was allowed to ask. "Is it bad?" she finally whispered. Clara's expression softened just enough to take the sting out of her words. "It means those men you found are part of something important. And that drive might tell us exactly what." The cold wind that curled through the ravine seemed sharper now, laced with a sense of urgency. Ash pressed closer to Mira's side while Ember paced at the perimeter, his small paws making quiet prints in the sand. When the first sweep of red and blue lights appeared on the horizon, the shadows under the bridge fractured into moving bands of color. A second vehicle rolled in behind the rescue truck, sleek, unmarked, and unmistakably law enforcement. Sheriff Briggs stepped out first, tall in his weathered brown coat, his silver hair catching the beam of a flashlight. His eyes took in the scene in one sweep: the injured men, the rescue crew, the girl with the 2 alert puppies standing guard. "Clara," he said by way of greeting. Then his gaze settled on Grant. "I hear we've got more than a medical rescue here." Clara handed him the USB without ceremony. "Found in the boot of the older one, Ryan Cole. He said it's tied to a smuggling operation. Both men need urgent transport, but I figured you'd want this in hand before we move them." Briggs turned the drive over once in his palm, then slipped it into a small evidence pouch from his coat pocket. "We'll run it through at the station. If it's what I think it is, we've been waiting for a break like this for months." He signaled to 2 deputies to begin documenting the area, photographing boot prints collecting shell casings marking the drag paths in the sand. The quiet efficiency of the work made the ravine feel smaller, like the walls had drawn in around the heart of the mystery. Grant glanced at Clara. "We need to get these men to the med tent. The cold's chewing up what time they've got." "Agreed," she said. Within minutes, Ryan and Elias were secured onto stretchers, heat blankets, and IV lines in place. Mira helped steady the straps while Grant adjusted a thermal wrap over Elias's head. As the rescuers lifted the stretchers toward the waiting truck, Mira looked up at her grandfather. "Are they going to be okay?" Grant met her gaze, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "They've got a chance now, and that's more than they had a few hours ago." Sheriff Briggs stepped aside to let the stretchers pass, but paused to address Mira directly. "You've done something brave tonight. That drive might change everything, but for now you just focus on getting warm." She nodded, her fingers curling into Ash's and Ember's fur. The two pups leaned against her legs, their breaths puffing in tiny clouds. The convoy of vehicles began to roll out rescue truck, leading Sheriff's SUV behind the deputies, still working the scene under portable lights. Above them, the steel frame of Ironshade loomed, its rusted ribs catching the last gleam of the search beams. Silver Hollow's quiet was gone, replaced by the hum of engines and the quiet, unspoken knowledge that the night had revealed more than anyone expected. And somewhere inside the evidence pouch in Sheriff Briggs's coat, the USB sat like a fuse, waiting for the spark. The town's old community hall had been transformed overnight into a temporary medical triage center. Canvas partitions divided the wide wood-floored space into makeshift treatment bays, the scent of antiseptic and brewing coffee mingling in the air. Folding tables lined one wall, cluttered with trauma kits, oxygen tanks, and the hum of portable heaters pushing back the chill of the desert night. Ryan lay propped against a cot pillow, a thick bandage wrapped around his ribs and an IV running into his arm. The harsh pallor in his face had eased to something closer to normal, though every movement still carried a trace of pain. Across from him, Elias was resting more deeply, his breathing steady under the glow of a small reading lamp clipped to the partition frame. Grant was talking quietly with a nurse at the far end of the bay when Ryan stirred. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on the ceiling for a moment before he shifted his gaze toward the entrance. Clara stepped in, holding a stainless steel mug of water. "You're back with us?" she said, her voice both matter-of-fact and reassuring. Ryan took a sip before speaking. "The USB, it's in safe hands." "It's with Sheriff Briggs," Clara confirmed. "And from what I hear, it's already proving its worth." Ryan closed his eyes briefly, as if in relief. That drive contains the entire logistics map, drop points, transport routes, payment channels. We were getting close to shutting the ring down when they realized we were onto them. That ambush under the bridge. They meant to make sure nothing left the canyon alive. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, absorbing the gravity of his words. "Well, you're alive. And now so is the evidence." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Sheriff Damon Briggs appeared at the edge of the curtain, his boots quiet against the old floorboards. He held a folder in one hand, the evidence pouch in the other. "Thought you'd like an update," he said, addressing Ryan, but glancing at Clara and Grant as well. "Our techs cracked the encryption on the drive. Everything you said checks out, and then some. There's enough here to justify coordinated raids from here to the border. We're launching tonight." The statement carried no bravado, only the quiet conviction of a man who had waited for this moment far too long. By morning, Briggs continued, half their infrastructure will be in pieces. And with the right follow-up, we can shut the rest down for good. Ryan gave a faint nod, the kind that carried satisfaction despite his exhaustion. "Good. That's worth the trouble." Briggs's gaze softened slightly when it shifted to Mira, who was standing just behind Grant, with Ash and Ember pressed close to her legs. "And it's thanks to more than just trained professionals," he said. "Sometimes the right people and dogs are in the right place at the right time." Mira's cheeks warmed. She looked down at the puppies, who were now more interested in sniffing the heater than in her embarrassment. Clara stepped over and crouched to meet Mira's eye level. You kept your head, you made smart calls, and you trusted your instincts. That's what saved lives tonight. Grant, standing at her shoulder, gave a slow nod of agreement. You saw trouble and you acted, Mira. That's not something everyone would do. The girl managed a small smile, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't need a medal or an announcement over the loudspeaker. The approval in their voices was more than enough. In the background, medical staff moved between cots, checking vitals, swapping out IV bags and logging patient notes on clipboards. Outside, the low rumble of engines came and went as more law enforcement units joined the operation. The hall felt like the nerve center of something larger than itself, part hospital, part command post. Briggs set the folder down on a nearby table. I'll keep you posted on the results of the raids. But for now, get some rest. We'll need full statements once you're stable. Ryan's eyes were already growing heavy again. Elias shifted slightly in his cot, murmuring something indistinct, but did not wake. Grant gestured toward a row of empty chairs against the wall. Come on, Mira. Let's give them some quiet. She followed him, Ash and Ember padding along their nails, clicking softly on the floorboards. In the dim glow of the heater, the puppies curled against her legs, warm and safe. For the first time since she'd chased them across the fields, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. Somewhere beyond the hall's wooden doors, the desert night still stretched wide and cold. But here inside, the hum of heaters, the low murmur of voices, and the quiet weight of shared relief, Silver Hollow felt just a little more protected. The desert morning broke with a rare clarity, the kind that followed a night of fierce storms. Only this storm had been made of sirens, engines, and the hurried radio chatter of law enforcement. News filtered back to Silver Hollow in fragments, at first multiple raids conducted across the county. Dozens of suspects taken into custody and several victims found in safe houses along the old freight route. By midday, the sheriff's office confirmed what the town had been hoping to hear: the smuggling network had been dealt a decisive blow. In the days that followed, Silver Hollow began to breathe again. The streets felt lighter, the air less charged with the unspoken tension that had hung over the town. Vendors returned to the central market, hanging strings of bright paper lanterns between their stalls. Children raced each other down the dusty lanes, their laughter carrying into the distance. But among the chatter of the market and the hum of reopened shops, one story seemed to travel faster than the rest. The tale of an 11-year-old girl who had followed her dogs into the dark and helped save 2 soldiers' lives. People spoke of Mira Dawson with a mix of admiration and disbelief, often shaking their heads at the thought of such courage from someone so young. Mira, for her part, didn't see herself as a hero. She returned to the small house on the edge of town and slipped back into her routines, though she noticed that strangers sometimes recognized her now. They would smile or nod some offering, a quiet, "Good job, kid," as she passed. One evening, Grant called her into the living room. The light from the setting sun stretched through the blinds, painting warm stripes across the worn sofa where he sat. Clara had stopped by as well, leaning against the doorway with her arms folded. Ash and Ember were sprawled at Mira's feet, their ears twitching at the occasional call of a bird outside. Mira Grant began, his voice steady, but carrying a weight of meaning. What you did out there was brave, no doubt about that, but it was also dangerous. I need you to understand both sides of it. She nodded slowly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. I know, Grandpa. I couldn't let Ash and Ember go alone. And when I found Ryan and Elias, I couldn't leave them there. Grant's gaze softened. And that's what makes you who you are. You acted because you cared. But in situations like that, we also have to think about how to get help without putting ourselves in more danger. Next time, I want you to promise you'll find a way to call me or someone before heading into trouble. Mira glanced down at the puppies, who were now watching her as if waiting for her answer. I promise, she said quietly. Clara stepped forward, her expression gentler than Mira had ever seen it. For what it's worth, your instincts were sharp. You stayed calm, and you did what you could. That's something we look for in search and rescue work. She crouched to scratch Ash behind the ears. Speaking of which, I think it's time these two had a bit more formal training. Mira's eyes lit up. You mean, like real rescue dogs, exactly, Clara said with a small smile. They already proved they have the drive and the focus. With the right training, they could be invaluable to the team. Grant chuckled. And I suppose that means we'll be hearing more about them around town. Not that they aren't local celebrities already. The next morning, training began in earnest. Clara brought over a small kit of gear, lightweight harnesses fitted to the puppies' growing frames, reflective collars, and a set of scent-tracking toys. They started with simple exercises in the backyard, teaching Ash and Ember to follow specific scent trails and respond to directional hand signals. The pups took to it quickly. Ash's sharp focus made him excel at locating hidden objects. His nose pressed low to the ground, tail swaying with purpose. Ember's boundless energy and determination made her a natural at alerting, barking sharply when she found what she was tasked to locate, then running back to signal her handler. Mira watched with a mix of pride and amazement. Just weeks ago, they had been rambunctious rescue pups, chasing each other through the tall grass. Now they were learning the skills that could one day save lives. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the desert sky in deep gold and violet, Mira was lying on the grass with Ash's head in her lap, and Ember curled against her side. Grant stood at the porch watching them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew these moments would become the stories they carried forward. Silver Hollow was calm again, the dangers of the past days fading into memory. Yet in the stillness, there was a sense that life here had changed just slightly, but enough. The town knew the names of Mira, Ash, and Ember now, and somewhere deep in the Mojave, the desert night held their story among its whispers. The morning of the ceremony dawned warm and golden, the kind of light that made even the dusty streets of Silver Hollow glow, as if they'd been polished overnight. The market stalls along Main Street stood empty. For once, the townspeople had closed to shop early, all drifting toward the central plaza. A small stage had been set up in front of the old town hall, draped in banners of red, white, and blue that fluttered gently in the desert breeze. Rows of folding chairs faced the stage, already filling with neighbors, friends, and strangers who had come to witness a rare kind of celebration. Mira stood behind the stage with Grant shifting her weight from foot to foot. She was wearing a simple white dress with a thin denim jacket, Grant's idea, saying it struck the right balance between casual and special. Ash and Ember sat on either side of her, their sleek black and tan coats brushed until they shone, each wearing a small navy blue bandana embroidered with the words, "Silver Hollow Search and Rescue." "You nervous?" Grant asked, his weathered hands resting on the back of a chair as he looked down at her. A little, Mira admitted. "I've never stood in front of the whole town before." Grant's eyes softened. "All you have to do is stand there and remember why we're here. It's not about the speech or the medal. It's about honoring what you did and what those two did," he said, nodding toward the pups. "And maybe giving the town something worth smiling about." From where they stood, Mira could see Sheriff Damon Briggs talking with Clara Haynes at the foot of the stage. The sheriff's broad frame was unmistakable, his tan Stetson angled just so, while Clara wore her standard rescue team jacket, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense braid. A few steps away, Ryan Cole and Elias Tran were leaning against the railing, still bearing faint traces of their injuries, but dressed sharply in clean-pressed shirts and dark slacks. When Ryan spotted Mira, his face broke into an unguarded smile, the kind that erased his normally stern, soldierly expression. Elias lifted a hand in greeting, his easy charm shining through even in the quiet moment before the ceremony. The mayor of Silver Hollow. A petite woman named Marlene Ortiz stepped up to the microphone as the hum of conversation faded into silence. "Good morning, Silver Hollow." She began, her voice carrying over the crowd with practiced ease. "We are gathered here today not because of tragedy, but because of triumph, because in the face of danger, courage and compassion prevailed." She spoke briefly of the events that had led to this day, careful not to dwell on the darker details. Her words painted a picture of resilience, a young girl who refused to turn away, two spirited pups who braved the desert night, and a community that had rallied to protect its own. Today, Mayor Ortiz continued, "We honor Mira Dawson with the Silver Hollow Young Courage Medal, awarded to those who demonstrate exceptional bravery in the service of others. And for the first time in our town's history, we also bestow the title of Honorary Rescue Dog upon Ash and Ember, whose instincts and loyalty saved lives." A ripple of applause swept through the crowd. Mira felt her cheeks warm as the mayor called her name. She stepped forward, Ash and Ember trotting obediently at her sides. Grant followed at a respectful distance, his posture upright, his eyes glinting with pride. On stage, the mayor draped a silver and blue ribbon around Mira's neck, the medal catching the sunlight in a sudden, dazzling flash. "You remind us," Ortiz said softly, "that bravery comes in all sizes, and that sometimes it is the smallest among us who make the greatest difference." Then Clara stepped forward, kneeling to fasten small, round tags onto the pups' collars. Each tag was etched with the words, "Honorary Rescue Dog." Silver Hollow, the letters polished until they gleamed. Ash tilted his head at the new weight on his collar, while Ember wagged her tail in a slow, proud rhythm. The applause rose again, and this time it carried an energy that Mira could feel in her chest, a mix of admiration, gratitude, and genuine joy. She glanced toward the front row where Ryan and Elias were now both on their feet, clapping along with the rest. When the ceremony ended, the stage became a gentle chaos of handshakes, photographs, and heartfelt words. Ryan approached first, moving slowly, but with a steady determination that marked his every action. "Mira," he said, his voice low but firm, "there aren't enough words to thank you. You didn't just find us, you gave us a chance to come home." Mira looked down, her fingers curling loosely around Ash's leash. "I just followed Ash and Ember. They knew something was wrong." Ryan smiled faintly. "That's true. But you chose to follow them, and you stayed when most people would have run. That matters." Elias stepped up beside him, his dark eyes bright with warmth. "We owe you big time. If you ever want to visit a base, see how we train, just say the word. I think you'd make a pretty great analyst." Grant, who had been listening from a few steps away, chuckled. "Let's give her a few more years before we sign her up for any military assignments." The group shared a quiet laugh, the tension of past days melting into something lighter. Yet as they talked, Grant's eyes never left Mira for long. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the ribbons and banners were being taken down, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did something remarkable," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But remember, preparation is as much a part of bravery as the act itself. Courage without readiness can turn into recklessness. If you want to help people again, and I know you do, we'll make sure you have the skills to do it safely." Mira met his gaze, understanding that beneath his pride was a promise that he would teach her, guide her, and make sure the next time she faced danger, she wouldn't be walking into it unprepared. That evening, the Dawson home was filled with the scents of roasted chicken and fresh bread, Grant's quiet way of marking the occasion. Ash and Ember sprawled on the kitchen floor, their new tags catching the light whenever they shifted. Mira sat at the table, her medal resting beside her plate, turning it over in her hands as she replayed the day in her mind. Outside, the desert sky burned with streaks of crimson and gold, fading into the deep indigo of night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called its voice, carrying across the open land. Mira listened for a moment, then reached down to rest her hand on Ash's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Silver Hollow had given her more than a medal that day. It had given her the understanding that bravery was not a single moment, but a choice made again and again, shaped by those who stood beside you. And as the first stars appeared above the Mojave, she felt certain that this was only the beginning. The first light of day spread gently across the Mojave, painting the sky in pale rose and gold. From the high ledge where they stood, the whole valley seemed to breathe the desert air, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush after a rare night mist. Below them, the old Ironshade bridge curved in a graceful arc, half hidden by drifting ribbons of morning fog. The steel beams glistened faintly with dew, and the river beneath whispered its slow journey eastward. Mira stood with her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her hair ruffled by the light desert wind. On her left, Ash sat, alert ears pricked forward. On her right, Ember leaned gently against her leg, his tail moving in a slow, steady sway. Behind them, Ryan stepped forward to the edge, his gaze scanning the land, as though memorizing every detail. He still carried the marks of what had happened, bandages beneath his shirt. A faint stiffness in his movements, but his posture had regained its quiet strength. "It's different in the daylight," he said, his voice low and steady. Hard to believe this was where everything almost ended. Mira looked up at him, the wind teasing the corner of her smile. But it didn't. "You're still here." Ryan's eyes softened, and for a moment the hardened lines of a soldier gave way to something warmer. "Yeah," he said. "And I've been thinking, maybe it's time I stayed here for a while. Silver Hollow could use a canine rescue program, and your grandpa's the best mentor I could ask for. Between him, Clara, and the two of us, we could build something that lasts." The idea settled between them like a new seed finding good soil. Mira's pulse quickened the thought of learning alongside Ryan, stirring the same excitement she'd felt the night she followed Ash and Ember into the dark. "If you stay," she said, "I want to learn everything. First aid search techniques, all of it. I want to be ready next time." Ryan smiled, not the brief guarded kind she'd seen before, but a full, steady smile that reached his eyes. "Deal. But it won't be easy. You'll have to work harder than you think you can, and your grandpa will be tougher on you than I will." "That's fine," Mira replied, glancing out over the valley again. "Some things are worth working for." A long silence followed, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The desert was waking up, sunlight spilling farther down into the valley, the fog lifting in slow, swirling threads. From somewhere far off, a hawk's cry sliced through the stillness, answered by the whisper of wind through dry grass. Ash lay down first, curling his body so that his head rested lightly on Mira's foot. Ember followed, pressing against her other side, his warm weight anchoring her in the cool morning air. Mira crouched to run her hands over their heads, feeling the smooth line of their ears, the soft rise and fall of their breathing. "They're going to be ready too," Ryan said quietly, watching the pups. "One day, they'll be out there saving lives with us." Mira nodded. She could already picture it, them running across open desert, tracking a scent, or standing beside her under a sky filled with stars, their loyalty as constant as the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying with it the mingled scents of sand and sage, and something else, something Mira could only describe as possibility. The moment felt bigger than the ledge they stood on, bigger than the valley itself, as if the land was leaning forward to listen. She drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly, her hand still resting on Ash and Ember. Above them, the rising sun cleared the last trace of fog from Ironshade, casting the bridge in clean, golden light. Here at the edge of the desert, with the wind in her hair and the steady presence of her friends beside her, Mira felt the truth of what they had all learned, that courage was a choice. Loyalty was a promise, and hope was the bridge between what had been and what could still be.